About that. Let me start all over here. Okay. All right. Okay. I want to discuss this line in the Haggadah. If you have a Haggadah, it's towards the end. Okay. It's I don't exactly know how to describe it. It's at the end of the 4 psukim. All right. We go through those 4 verses and we evaluate. We analyze each word in those 4 verses. So if you go to towards the end of that. All right, it's before the Rebbe Yehuda with the Ditzach Hadash Ba'achav, that whole business. Okay, if you go to before that, so then you'll see the Haggadah. That's the part that we're going to talk about. Okay, so basically, what the Haggadah is doing over here. Let me give a brief intro to what we're doing, and then I want to analyze one of the lines. Okay, the Haggadah is going through these 4 verses that describe the history, the story of the Yetzias Mitzrayim very briefly, very quickly. Okay, and the Haggadah is analyzing each of those words. Okay, so now why are we doing this? So basically, what's going on over here is the following: that the Haggadah has been telling us that we're going to tell the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, right? The story of the Exodus. That's the whole point of the Haggadah, that we're going to go through the whole story. So you would think, right, what are we going to do? In other words, how are we going to tell the story, right? The story takes hours to read in the Torah, right? We take weeks of parshas to read through the whole story. So the Haggadah has a real dilemma over here, which is, how is he going to make sense? How is he going to read through the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, all of the details of the slavery and the 10 plagues and the redemption, right? How is he going to go through all of that in one night, right? We still have to get to the meal. Right, we have to do the matzah, the maror. We have a lot to do. So how are we going to tell this whole story? How are we going to go through all the details in a sort of brief amount of time, in a relatively brief amount of time? Okay, so the way the Haggadah solved this problem, all right, the solution that he came up with is an interesting one, which is that he found later on in the Torah, in the book of Dvarim, okay, later on in the Torah, he found that there are 4 verses that summarize the history of the whole story, okay, in 4 verses, quickly. So the Haggadah decided that the best way to resolve this issue is to go through those 4 psukim, which is much quicker than reading hundreds of psukim in the book of Shmos. And that way we'll tell the summary of the story. We'll go through the story more quickly, and that will be the end of it, okay? So that's how the Haggadah solves this problem. Now, not only does he quote these 4 verses, but he also analyzes the verses. Okay, and I always think this is one of the most underappreciated parts of the Haggadah. First of all, because people get there, it's already late into the night, so people are tired, right? And they sort of rush through those psukim. That's one, that's the one reason why it's not that appreciated, but also because it's a little more technical. Okay, you got to really understand what the Haggadah is trying to do with each of those psukim, and even the words themselves, right? He goes through each of the words and he explains it very often in very creative, sort of unusual ways, right? Not in the simple meaning of the psukim. And the reason is because the Haggadah comes from the world of the Medrash, right? He's one of the rabbis he's like part of the rabbis that put together the Medrash. So they find meaning and allusion and all sorts of deeper layers of meaning in every word of the Torah. So the same thing for the Haggadah, right? He's not going to just quote the verses and that's it, be done with it. But the Haggadah is going to take each line of the Torah and each word of the Torah and find all sorts of deeper meanings and associations and interpretations and all sorts of stuff like that. All right. So it's very, very interesting to see what the Haggadah does with all these verses. And again, most of us just read through it very quickly. I know every year I hope to spend a lot of time on it at the Seder, but by the time you get there, it's just so late and, people are tired and it's hard to do. So a lot of times I end up just reading through it. And I think a lot of people just read through it and sort of understand the words, but they don't understand the deeper meaning of what the Haggadah is doing. All right, because the Haggadah is really doing an unbelievable thing over here. He's going through these 4 verses and he's interpreting each word. And you got to see exactly what he's trying to do, right? How is he interpreting the word in a way that's different than we would have interpreted it on our own, right? So there's really a lot of work to do over here. And then in addition, through this process, he brings in a lot of new ideas that are not explicit in the Torah, right? That's the way the Medrash works, that they introduce all sorts of themes and concepts that are not explicit in the simple meaning of the words, but you got to go deeper in order to try to understand it. All right. So very, very interesting what's going on over here. So what I want to do is, we're not going to go through the whole thing, obviously, right now, but I want to just choose one line. All right. And I want to go through it and try to understand what the Haggadah is saying, and what what the meaning of it is, right? What the purpose of it is, and how he's deriving layers of meaning from the Torah that we would not have seen on our own. Okay. So let's go through this line towards the end of the 4th verse. Okay, so the verse itself, I'll read you the verse. Okay, the verse in the Torah says the following, that Vayotzienu Hashem miMitzrayim biyad chazaka. Hashem took us out of Egypt with a strong hand, ubizroa netuya, with an outstretched forearm, uvemora gadol, with great awe, with great fear, ubaosos uvemofsim, with signs and wonders. Okay, so the Torah says that this seems like a pretty straightforward verse, right? It says that there's 5 things that Hashem took us out of Egypt: with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, great fear, and signs and wonders. Okay, now the Haggadah is going to go through each of these phrases and explain it on a deeper level. So let's go to the Uvemora Gadol. Okay, that's the one I want to focus on tonight. Uvemora gadol, with great fear. So the Haggadah says, Zu gilui hashchina. That is a reference to God's presence, the Shekhinah, right? The divine presence becoming manifest, becoming seen. Okay, so this is already an unbelievable idea, right? Before we go any further, let's just pause for a minute, right? This is an unbelievable idea. What's the Haggadah saying? That God's presence was seen in Egypt. Okay, this is not something we knew from the Torah itself, right? I assume a lot of people even read through the Haggadah and don't even really understand this every year, right? We don't. If you read the Torah, so it says that God did the plagues, right? He killed the firstborn, but we don't see anywhere explicitly that God appeared in Egypt, that his presence, his Shekhinah, was evident in Egypt, right? Where do we see that God's presence appeared in the Torah? At the giving of the Torah. Right, at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai, God appears. But we never see explicitly in the Torah that God appeared in Egypt. So this is already very, very interesting what the Haggadah is telling us, right? Somehow the Haggadah sees in the words Uvemora Gadol, with great fear, Zu Gilui Hashchina, that God's presence appeared in Egypt. Okay, now what I want to understand is a few things. There's 3 things that I want to go through right now. First of all, where does the Haggadah find this in those words, right? If we read the words great awe, I don't think we'd ever see that God's presence appeared in Egypt. So where did the Haggadah find that? Okay, number 2, we want to understand where did this happen, right? And most of us have read through this story very often, right? Where did God's presence appear? And number 3, what is the reason the Haggadah feels this is so important? Right, the Haggadah is only focused on the main things that happened that night in Egypt, or the main parts of the Exodus from Egypt. So what is the Haggadah? Why does the Haggadah feel that this is so important that it's worth mentioning as one of the very few things that he's going to talk about in the Seder? Right, he's not able to cover everything. He chooses the highlights. So why is this one of the highlights? All right, so let's go through those questions in order. Again, where does the Haggadah find this from? When, in fact, did this actually happen in the story? And number 3, why does the Haggadah feel that this is one of the highlights? Okay, so let's start with how the Haggadah sees this. Okay, so the Haggadah continues, and he actually brings a proof. Okay, and he says the following: Kama shenemar, as it says, O hanisa Elokim lavo lakachas lo goy mikerev goy. Right? Did God ever try to take a nation from another nation? B'masos, b'osos, u'b'mofsim, u'b'melchama, u'b'yad chazaka, u'b'zron etuya, u'b'moraim gedolim, kechol asher. Okay, with enigmas, with signs, with wonders, with war, with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm, with awesome acts. Kechol asher asa lachem Hashem Elokechem b'Mitzrayim le'einecha. like all that Hashem, your God, did for you in Egypt in front of your eyes. Okay. So the Haggadah quotes a verse from earlier in Devarim in chapter 4, which you can already hear that it has a lot of the same verbs, right? A lot of the same nouns, really, right? That God took us out of Egypt with signs and wonders and war and great awe and all of that, right? So these two verses are very similar. They both have very similar language. So the Haggadah seems to be comparing these two psukim, right? One of the psukim is later in Devarim, one of them is earlier. And we're interpreting the later one based on the earlier one. And somehow the earlier one tells us that the later one is telling us that God's presence appeared in Egypt. But this is very unclear, right? What does the earlier verse say that's any different than the later verse? I mean, again, if you don't have the Haggadah in front of you, so if you have a Haggadah in front of you, then it's probably, you can see this more clearly. But if you don't have a Haggadah, I'll just say it more clearly. The first verse said, "Be'osus u'v'mofsim b'yad chazaka v'zron tuyav v'morah gadol v'osus u'v'mofsim," right? That God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, signs and wonders, and great awe. The second verse said almost the same thing, right? B'yad chazaka v'zron tuyav v'moraim gedolim, with the mighty hand and outstretched arm and great awe, right? And great wonders. So what is that verse adding to our understanding of the whole Haggadah? Right? What is that verse adding to our understanding of it? Okay, so let's understand what the Haggadah is doing here to begin with, and then we'll try to make sense of what this verse proves. Okay, there's two ways to understand what the Haggadah is doing. One of them is not so creative. Okay, I'll start with the more basic one, which is, how do we see Morah Gadol means great fear? It means that people were in fear of God in Egypt. So how do we derive from that God's presence appeared in Egypt? So the Ritva, in his commentary on the Haggadah, he says something very basic. And he says that the word morah, again, means fear, right? Yira means fear. Morah means to fear someone. So they feared God. Now, why did they fear God so much? Because they saw his presence, right? Anyone that would see the presence of God would fear God. That's obvious. So how is the Haggadah deriving this lesson, this idea that they saw God from the Haggadah, right? Or from the word Morah Gadol, from the verse Morah Gadol. Where does the Haggadah see that the word Morah Gadol, great fear, means that they saw God? The answer is because why did they fear God so much? Because they saw him. Okay, so this is what we would call like an assumption, right? The Haggadah was reading, the guy who wrote the Haggadah was reading the Torah, and it said that the Egyptians feared God. So he said it must be that they saw God. Okay, that is the first way of interpreting this. Like I said, that's sort of the less creative way. The more creative way is that what does the word morah mean? Okay, it could come from the word yira, which means fear, but it could also come from the word mar'eh, which means a vision, right? Like a mar'eh is a sight, to see something, a vision. So the Haggadah is interpreting this verse very, very creatively. Uvimorah gadol does not mean with great fear, it means with great visions. Okay, the word morah in this verse, the way the Haggadah interprets it, is not fear, but it has to do with vision. So it's saying that the Egyptians saw tremendous things. What did they see? They saw the image, the presence of God. Okay, this is unbelievably creative, right? This is a good example. This is a good example of the way the Haggadah creatively interprets these verses, right? This is what I was saying before, that a lot of times you could just read through it and miss exactly what he's doing, right? This is a good example of that. How I think about how many times I read through this, I didn't really understand what he was trying to do, right? The Haggadah is saying, he's not just saying b'morah gadol, there was fear, so that means they saw God, and it's a random association. He's very creatively reinterpreting this whole verse. What does b'morah gadol in this context mean? It doesn't mean fear, it means vision. So it means that they saw God. All right, unbelievable. I mean, I think this really, like I said, if we could go through, 10, 15 examples in the Haggadah of this, it would show us how brilliant what the Haggadah is doing. It would change our whole Seder. Okay, now how does the Haggadah know this? Right, again, we just said the problem is he quotes a verse, right? He quotes this verse that doesn't seem to prove the point. So how does the Haggadah prove his point from this earlier verse? So here there's two options. Okay, one is the more basic one, which is that at the end of the earlier verse, it adds a phrase which was not in the second verse, in the later verse. Okay, in the earlier pasuk, it says, "Kechol asher asa lachem Hashem Elokeichem b'Mitzrayim le'einecha," like all of the things that Hashem your God did in Egypt in front of your eyes. So this verse references the Jews seeing these things, as opposed to the other verse, which never says anything about anyone seeing it. So that's the first possibility for how they proved it from the word le'einecha. It means you saw something. So that tells us that the word morah in this context must refer to a vision, not fear. Okay, so this is a very beautiful interpretation of the Haggadah, and some of the commentators say this. I didn't make this up, but right, what he's basically saying is morah gadol. What does morah mean? Does it mean fear? Does it mean vision? So because another verse uses the same phrase moraim gedolim, with great fears, and there it means, and then there it says that you saw in your eyes. So it must refer not to fear but to visions. Right? You saw great visions with your eyes. So we see from that the word morah refers to visions. Okay, very, very interesting. Now there is another way to explain this. Okay, to explain what the second verse is adding to the verse that the Haggadah is interpreting, and that is that the other verse is in the plural. Right, the pasuk that the Haggadah is talking about is uvimorah gadol, with great morah. The other pasuk is in the plural, uvimoraim gedolim, with great moraim. So if you translate it as fear, the plural doesn't really make sense, right? How could you say with great fears? That doesn't really make sense. So from the fact that the Torah uses the phrase uvimoraim gedolim in the plural, the Haggadah said it must be visions. Because vision, you could say in the plural, right, with great visions. So that's why the Haggadah had to. That's how the Haggadah proved that uvimoraim gedolim, right, from the fact that the other pasuk is in the plural. So it must be that morah refers not to fear but to visions. And once we know that moraim gedolim is great visions, so then we can derive back to this pasuk that morah gadol refers to vision, not to fear. Okay, so that's so we answered the first of our three questions. How does the Haggadah prove this point? So we saw his creative reinterpretation of the word morah, that it does not mean fear, it means vision, and we saw how two possibilities for how he proves that from the pasuk that he quotes as the proof text for this. Okay, so let's move on to our second question, which is, when did this happen in Egypt? Right? When did this happen? If you read through the Torah, you don't see God's presence appear in Egypt. So when did this happen? So here there's a few different options. Let me start with the Ritva. Okay, and again, this is not clear in the Torah, so any of these options are going to have somewhat of a problem. Okay, the Ritva says the following. He says that there were two times that God appeared to the Jews in Egypt. One is when God gave Moshe and Aaron the law of Rosh Chodesh. Right, it says that Hashem appeared to Moshe and Aaron, and he gave them the rules of Rosh Chodesh, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem, and they were still in Egypt. So that's the first time that Hashem appeared in Egypt. And the second time, says the Ritva, is at Makas Bechoros, right, when they, on the night of redemption, on the night when they left. Actually, I'm sorry, he doesn't say Makas Bechoros. He just says the night when they left. Okay, then he says that after that, okay, so it doesn't sound like this was no longer in Egypt, but after that, in the process of the redemption, Hashem appeared another time, which is at Yam Suf, right, at the splitting of the sea, because the Torah explicitly says, "Vayiru ha'ames Hashem," that the people saw Hashem at the splitting of the sea, at Kriyas Yam Suf. The Jews saw Hashem. Okay, and the Torah says, right, one of the things that they say in the song there is Zek Helivan Behu, this is my God. So the rabbis say that they were literally like pointing to him, right? This is my God. They could see him. Right, the rabbis say Rasa Shivcha Alayam, that a maidservant, the lowest person at the splitting of the sea, saw Hashem more than the greatest prophet Yechezkel. So it's very clear that the Jews saw God at the splitting of the sea. So the Ritva says that there were three times when the Jews saw God. Okay, two of them were actually in Egypt. One was when he showed Moshe about Rosh Chodesh. One of them was on the night of redemption. And then later on, after they left Egypt, so then they were at the splitting of the sea, they saw him again. So what is the Ritva saying? He's basically saying that we don't count any later sightings of God that were outside of Egypt. It has to have been in Egypt itself. Okay, so that's why the splitting of the sea doesn't count really, because that wasn't exactly in Egypt. All right, it has to be in Egypt itself that they saw God. Now, the Ritva though does count if only Moshe saw him, right? So it sounds like in the Haggadah that the whole nation had to see him, but according to the Ritva, only Moshe saw him that first time, and that still counts. Okay, so basically, the Ritva's view of this is that it doesn't have to be the whole nation, but it has to be someone saw God in Egypt, whether that was Moshe, whether that was everybody. That happened twice in Egypt and once at the splitting of the sea. Okay, that's one option. Another one of the commentators, the Ravan, so he writes explicitly that it was when God killed the firstborns, right? Because the Haggadah says that God himself killed the firstborns, not anyone else. So that means that God appeared then, and I guess somehow they could see him, right? Not just he appeared and he did the deed, but they were able to actually see him as he was doing it. I'll tell you something very interesting in this context. One of the great Hasidic Rebbes was Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa. So in his commentary on the Torah, Kol Simcha, he says, very interesting idea. He says that God did not punish the Egyptian firstborns. It wasn't a punishment. The way that the plague of the firstborns worked was that God appeared in Egypt. He made his presence known in Egypt. And that automatically decimated everything else that was like a competitor of God. So that's why the Torah says that not only did the firstborns die that night, but the Torah says, B'chol Elohei Mitzrayim Eseh Shvatim, that God killed all of the Egyptian gods that night. He destroyed all of the Egyptian gods. So Reb Simcha Bunim explained that the reason all the gods of Egypt were destroyed that night was because since God's presence became so powerful, so all the other gods immediately, like all the other false gods were immediately destroyed. And the same is true of the firstborns, because since God is the ultimate first, so once he made his presence known that night, anything else that was a competitor, so to speak, was immediately destroyed. So that's why the firstborns were destroyed. And he says that's why even the firstborns of the maids, right? Let's say the slaves in Egypt had firstborns, or the non-Egyptians in Egypt had firstborns, they also all died that night, even though they'd done nothing wrong. They never enslaved the Jews. But because God's presence was so powerful that night, everything automatically was destroyed. Anything that was considered a firstborn was destroyed. Only the Jewish firstborns were able to survive. Okay, so this is a very interesting idea that God didn't actually kill anyone. He just made his presence there, and that automatically destroyed the firstborns and all the false gods. So that might be what the Haggadah is referencing here, according to the Ravan, that since God made his presence known, all of the firstborns were immediately destroyed, and that's when the Jews saw God's presence. Okay, okay. One final suggestion comes from the Tashbates, and he suggests in his commentary that it's a reference to the clouds of glory, to the Ananei HaKavod, right? The clouds that surrounded the Jews, that traveled with them. The Torah says, "V'Hashem holech lifneihem yomam v'layla," that God went in front of them day and night. So that's when the Jews saw the presence of God at the clouds of glory. Okay, so this is interesting because, first of all, it's also outside of Egypt, right? The clouds, I don't think that they appeared in Egypt itself. They seem to have appeared after the Jews got out of the Egyptian perimeter, after they were out of the boundaries over there. So it doesn't sound like the clouds were in Egypt themselves, but according to the Tashbates, it still counts. All right, so I think that's interesting. The commentator, the publisher of the Tashbates has another question, which is he says that the Torah never said that the Jews saw God's presence in the clouds of glory, right? It just says that God was there with them, but it never says that the Jews actually saw God's presence in the clouds of glory. But either way, those are three ideas that the commentators have. All right, either God appeared when he gave Moshe the law of Rosh Chodesh, when he at the night of redemption he was there, and at Kriyas, at the splitting of the sea he was there. That's one approach. The second approach is that he was there when the firstborns were killed. They could see his presence. And number three is that he was there at the clouds of glory, the Anane HaKavod. All right, so again, you can see that the commentators are struggling a little bit to figure out when they saw God's presence, because it's not totally clear in the Torah. But this is the whole point of the Haggadah, that he's trying to bring out the point of when the Jews saw God, that he's trying to bring this out, even though it's not explicit in the Torah. Okay, let me end with the last question, which is, why does the Haggadah feel that this is so important? Right? What is so significant about this? So the Ritva says two very important things. He says, first of all, God should not have appeared in Egypt because there were so many idols in Egypt. In fact, there are some midrashim, there are some rabbis in the Medrash that believe that God would never appear in Egypt because there were so many idols, there was so much idolatry, that God would never appear in Egypt. It was not befitting God to come into a city that was so filled with idolatry. So what the Haggadah is saying is that the opposite. The Haggadah is of the view with other rabbis in the Medrash that God made an exception that night, and he appeared to the Jews in order to that's the first point, right? God made an exception to the rule that he shouldn't have been in Egypt because of the idolatry in order to show himself and help the Jews out. Okay, so that's the first major point. The second major point that the Ritva makes is that God had promised Yaakov, "V'gam anochi elcha gam alo," I will bring you out of Egypt. So that sounded like God himself will help them out of Egypt. So in order to fulfill his promise, God went down to Egypt that night in order to bring the Jews out, in order to fulfill his promise. Okay? So those are two very beautiful ideas, that God had to do it on his own because he told Yaakov, and that also that God that God entered a city of idolatry in order to help the Jews out. Now, the last thing I would just add is that obviously what the Haggadah is also doing is he's making a statement over here, right? That what we celebrate is not just freedom. We celebrate the fact that we have this relationship with God, that we became the chosen people, and that we are able to keep the Torah. So the Haggadah is making a very powerful statement here, that the purpose of what we're doing at the Seder night is not just a history lesson. We're not just telling stories and Baba Mises and telling history. We're reminding ourselves that we are the people of God. God has to be at the background of this whole story, right? If God is not at the center, not the background, but at the center of the whole story, then we're not doing our job. Okay, so the Haggadah very, very powerfully emphasizes this point, that the whole story has to center around God's presence and becoming his people and connecting with him. All right, so with that, I will wish everyone a wonderful Yontif next week, and hopefully, we'll have a meaningful Seder, and this will help make our study of the Haggadah a little bit better.